You are my rock, my dear.
And you my heart's peace.
Subscribe to Wild West Soul Stories. Hit the bell, like, comment, and share. Thanks for watching. Behind the counter stood a woman with hair the color of autumn leaves touched by frost, her brown eyes holding a depth of emotion that struck him like lightning. She wore a simple blue dress, and her hands, though showing the work of years, still moved with the grace he remembered from 40 years ago. Margaret Sullivan. Maggie. She looked at him, and her eyes filled with tears that she did not try to hide. Elijah felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He had left this town when he was 22 years old, running from a love that frightened him more than any mountain storm ever could. He had been young and foolish, convinced that he was not worthy of a woman like Margaret, certain that his restless soul would only bring her pain. So he had disappeared into the wilderness without saying goodbye, leaving behind the only woman who had ever made his heart feel like it belonged to someone else. Now she stood before him, 40 years later, and the weight of every single day he had spent without her crashed down upon him like an avalanche. Margaret spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. She said his name like a prayer, like something sacred she had been holding on to for decades. Elijah could not find words. He stood there, his fur-covered coat making him look like a bear that had wandered into civilization. His eyes locked on the woman he had never stopped loving, even when he told himself he had forgotten. She walked around the counter slowly, her steps measured, her gaze never leaving his face. When she reached him, she lifted her hand and touched his weathered cheek, her fingers tracing the lines that time had carved into his skin. She asked him why he left, why he disappeared without a word, why he broke her heart and never came back. Elijah's voice came out rough, damaged by years of disuse and the emotion choking his throat. He told her the truth, the same truth he had been running from his entire life. He said he was scared of loving her so much that it made him weak, scared of staying in one place when his soul craved the mountains, scared of being the husband she deserved when he barely knew how to be a man. Margaret listened, her hand still resting on his face, her tears falling freely now. She told him she had waited. She had waited for him for 5 years after he left, refusing every man who came calling, certain that he would return. When she finally accepted that he was gone forever, she had married a good man named Thomas, who had loved her faithfully for 30 years until his death 5 years ago. But she told Elijah something that shattered every wall he had built around his heart. She said that even during her marriage, even while loving Thomas with genuine affection, there had been a part of her heart that remained locked away. A part that belonged only to Elijah Blackwood, the young man with wild eyes and gentle hands who had stolen her soul when she was barely 18 years old. Elijah stepped back, overwhelmed by her confession. He told her he was too old now, too set in his ways, too accustomed to the silence of the mountains and the company of wolves and elk. He said he had forgotten how to be soft, how to speak tenderly, how to exist in a world that required more than survival. He said he was too old for marriage, too old for love, too old for anything except the slow walk toward whatever waited for him on the other side of life. Margaret grabbed his hands, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her years. She looked into his eyes with a fire that had not diminished despite the decades, and she said the words that would change everything. She said she had waited for him. 40 years. She had waited through youth and middle age and into the twilight of her life. She had waited through another marriage, through burying a husband, through watching her children grow and leave. She had waited without knowing if she would ever see him again, holding on to a love that most people would call foolish. She asked him if he was really going to make her wait any longer. Elijah felt something break inside him, something that had been frozen for 40 years. He looked at this woman, this beautiful, patient, faithful woman, who had carried his memory like a treasure through all the seasons of her life. And he realized that he had been running from happiness for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like. He pulled her into his arms, his large frame enveloping her smaller one, his face buried in her hair that smelled of lavender and home. He held her while she cried, while he cried, while 40 years of separation poured out between them in tears and trembling and whispered apologies. The customers in the store had stopped their shopping. The owner, Margaret's nephew, stood watching with wide eyes. But neither Elijah nor Margaret noticed anything except each other. When they finally separated, Elijah cupped her face in his rough hands and looked at her with eyes that had seen the highest peaks and the deepest valleys, but had never witnessed anything as beautiful as this moment. He asked her if she would still want him. A broken man who had spent his life running, a mountain hermit who talked to trees more than people, an old fool who had wasted decades living without the only woman he had ever loved. Margaret smiled through her tears, and for a moment, Elijah saw the 18-year-old girl, who had captured his heart by the creek behind her father's farm all those years ago. She said she had always wanted him, only him, forever him. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town. Margaret's children came from distant places to witness their mother marry the legendary mountain man they had heard about in whispered stories. They were skeptical at first, protective of the woman who had given them life, uncertain about this stranger who had hurt her so long ago. But when they saw the way Elijah looked at their mother, the way his entire being seemed to soften in her presence, the way he spoke to her like she was the most precious thing in creation, they understood. Some loves are not bound by time or logic or circumstance. Some loves simply are, burning quietly through the years, waiting for the right moment to blaze into fullness. The ceremony was simple. Margaret wore a cream-colored dress that she had sewn herself, her silver-streaked hair arranged with wildflowers that Elijah had gathered from the meadow where they had first kissed as teenagers. Elijah wore a new suit that felt foreign against his skin, his beard trimmed for the first time in years, his eyes never leaving his bride. When the preacher asked if he would take this woman as his wife, Elijah's voice did not waver. He said yes with a certainty that surprised even himself, a certainty that had been building for 40 years in the deepest chambers of his heart. When Margaret said her vows, she spoke of waiting, of faith, of a love that had survived silence and distance and the passage of time. She spoke of the young man who had shown her what love meant, and the old man who had finally come home to claim it. There was not a dry eye in the church. After the ceremony, the town gathered for a celebration. Music filled the evening air as fiddles played and people danced on the wooden platform constructed for the occasion. Children ran between the legs of adults, laughter echoing through the streets. Elijah stood at the edge of the celebration watching Margaret dance with her grandchildren, her face lit with joy that made her look decades younger. She caught his eye and smiled, a private smile meant only for him, and Elijah felt his heart swell with emotions he had denied himself for so long. Margaret's daughter approached him as the evening wore on. Her name was Sarah, and she had her mother's eyes. She stood beside him in silence for a moment before speaking. She told him that her mother had never stopped talking about him. Even when Sarah was a child, she had heard stories about the mountain man who had loved her mother before she met her father. Sarah had grown up thinking it was just a fairy tale, a romantic story to entertain children. But now, watching them together, she understood. It was never just a story. It was the truth of her mother's heart, waiting patiently to be fulfilled. She asked Elijah to promise her something. She asked him to never leave our mother again, to stay, to love her, to give her the life she had dreamed about for 40 years. Elijah looked at this woman who was asking him to be worthy of her mother's devotion. He placed his weathered hand over his heart and made a vow that he intended to keep until his last breath. He promised. The following months brought adjustments for both of them. Margaret had spent decades running a household and later the general store after her nephew took ownership, but valued her expertise. Elijah had spent those same decades living in complete solitude, his only companions the creatures of the forest. Learning to share a life was not easy. Elijah would sometimes forget that he was no longer alone and would sit in silence for hours, lost in thoughts that Margaret could not access. Margaret would sometimes fill the silence with words, unaware that Elijah needed the quiet to feel at peace. They had their first argument 3 months after the wedding, over something so small that neither could remember what started it. Elijah grabbed his coat and headed for the door, his old instincts telling him to run, to return to the mountains where things were simpler. But Margaret caught his arm. She did not yell or cry or demand that he stay. She simply looked at him with those brown eyes that had haunted his dreams for 40 years, and asked him one question. She asked if he was going to run again. The question stopped him cold. He stood at the threshold, 1 foot in the house and 1 foot reaching for escape, and he saw his entire life laid out before him. He saw the decades of loneliness, the empty nights, the conversations he had with himself because there was no one else to speak to. He saw the walls he had built, the love he had rejected, the happiness he had convinced himself he did not deserve. And he saw Margaret, standing there with patient love in her eyes, giving him the choice that she had given him 40 years ago. This time, Elijah chose differently. He closed the door. He removed his coat. He walked to his wife and wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had always felt unstable beneath his feet. He told her he was sorry. He told her he was trying. He told her that learning to stay was harder than surviving any mountain winter, but he was not going to stop fighting for this life they were building together. Margaret held him back, her strength surprising him still. She told him she knew it was hard. She knew he was trying, and she wanted him to know that she was not going anywhere, that she would stand beside him through every struggle, that her love was not conditional on his perfection. She had waited 40 years. She could be patient a little longer. Spring came to Willow Creek with wildflowers and warm breezes, and Elijah found himself learning to live in ways he had never imagined. He helped at the general store, his knowledge of the mountains and the hunting trade proving valuable. He built furniture in a workshop behind their home, his hands finding new purpose in creation rather than just survival. But the greatest change was in his heart. He learned to say "I love you," words that had terrified him when he was young. He learned to reach for Margaret's hand when they walked through town, to kiss her forehead when she brought him coffee in the morning, to sit beside her on the porch in comfortable silence as the sun set over the mountains he had once called home. One evening, as they sat together watching the stars emerge, Margaret leaned against his shoulder and asked him if he had any regrets. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about his life in the mountains, the beauty he had witnessed, the peace he had found in solitude. He thought about the years he had missed, the children he might have had, the life that could have been if he had been brave enough to stay. He told her that he regretted the time they lost, the years he spent running when he should have been loving, the fear that kept him from the only happiness that ever truly mattered. But he also told her that perhaps those years had been necessary. Perhaps he had needed the mountains to shape him, to teach him patience and endurance and the value of silence. Perhaps he had needed to learn how to survive alone before he could learn how to live with someone else. And perhaps, he said, holding her closer, they were exactly where they were supposed to be, exactly when they were supposed to be there. Margaret lifted her head and kissed him, a gentle kiss that held all the tenderness of their youth and all the depth of their years. She told him that she believed in fate, in God's timing, in the idea that some stories take longer to tell because their endings are meant to be more beautiful. Their story had taken 40 years to reach this moment, but sitting here, under the stars, with the man she had always loved by her side, Margaret knew it was worth every second of waiting. Elijah looked at his wife. At this woman, who had held on to faith when he had given her every reason to let go. He saw the young girl who had loved him by the creek, and the older woman who loved him still, and he understood something that had eluded him his entire life. Home was never a place. Home was a person, and he had finally, after all these years, come home. He told her he loved her, his voice rough with emotion but clear with certainty. He told her he would love her until his last breath and beyond, wherever souls went when they left this earth. He told her that she had saved him, not from the mountains, but from himself. Margaret smiled, the same smile that had captured his heart when they were young. She told him she would hold him to that promise. And as they sat together in the gathering darkness, two old souls who had finally found their way back to each other, the mountains stood silent witness to a love that had outlasted time itself.